Welcome to Justice Works New York. We're gathered here today all together at a pretty strange time in our political history. I was thinking about how at our conference 2 years ago in the spring of 2009, we were all here euphoric about having elected a president who not only ran on an agenda of progressive change, but whose election itself made us feel that our country was ready for change. If we could elect an African-American president with the name Barack Hussein Obama, things must really be different, we thought. And we were also on the verge, we thought at the time, of passing comprehensive national health care reform before summer and then be ready to move on to the next initiative. At the same time, in the spring of 2009, we were looking at the fact that we collectively, as a progressive movement in New York State, had also elected a Democratic state Senate, had won fair share tax reform, Rockefeller drug law reform, and the bigger, better bottle bill. We had stopped education and healthcare budget cuts, and we'd won important expansions of state healthcare coverage. Now, here we are 2 years later, and although there's continued to be a lot of issue progress since then, we did pass major healthcare reform as well as financial reform at the federal level. We won important issue victories each year at the local and state levels. But even with those accomplishments, I think we could all agree that we've moved dramatically backward from 2 years ago. We're living in a whole different world. Instead of a feeling of hope and change, we're in the midst of a politics that has moved farther right than we ever imagined, with public policy now being shaped heavily to satisfy the wealthy, the big banks, and the large corporate political donors. How did we move so far in the wrong direction so fast? So I want to talk a little bit this morning about why that is, what we can learn from our opponents of the Tea Party, and what we can do together to shift the state and ultimately the country toward an economy that really does work for all of us. We collectively in this room as the progressive movement have won important issue campaigns, but the fact is we've been losing the overall battle for the future of our country and our state. And we're losing that battle not because the public disagrees with us, but because we haven't actually fought the battle over ideas and values. We have not offered a clear counter message that connects to our core values. People in this country and our state are discouraged because the economy is not recovering and because government is not delivering real solutions. And the right has a simple message for them: cut spending, cut taxes, and the economy will be strong. And in the past, we've only had a real counter message on very specific issues. You'll be better off if we have a little better health care, if we have a little better schools. We haven't encountered their fundamental, simple message. And I just want to give two examples of that. Our campaign for fair share tax reform in 2009, a lot of you were involved in that. Governor Patterson at the time proposed a budget that drastically cut spending on education, healthcare, and human services. A broad coalition came together, organized for an income tax surcharge on the wealthiest New Yorkers instead of spending cuts, and we won. The surcharge passed. It added over $3 billion to the budget that year, over $4 billion in 2010, and stopped billions in cuts to education, healthcare, and the safety net. Yet despite that, despite the fact that we made our state better, the dominant narrative continued to be, to this day, that we need to cut taxes to grow our economy, and that millionaires will just leave the state if we tax them, led by Golisano, who unfortunately didn't leave the state fast enough. Yeah. He just stuck around to first make sure that he could buy our entire state senate. It worked for him for a little while, then he finally left. Another example, national health care reform. So in 2010, we did finally pass a national plan to provide universal coverage. And although it wasn't all we wanted, it was a historic expansion and is about to be an historic expansion of the social contract and a major step forward in reforming our healthcare system. Yet the dominant narrative became that Obamacare was government overstepping its bounds, stepping on our freedom, even killing our grandmothers. People believe this and bought into it because we've been losing this message war, and those are just two examples. It's not just message in the narrow sense, because people a lot of times talk about framing message, but it's not just about a slogan or a simple message. It's about our deeply held values and views as a nation of who we want to be and what we want to stand for. And when the Tea Partyers took over the town hall meetings during the summer of 2009, they made it clear what they stood for. They said everyone's on their own and the government has no positive role to play. They had that old, pull yourself up by your bootstraps approach. They believed that any benefit to somebody else actually brings harm to them. They believed that if we expanded health care to cover everyone, they would actually be worse off. And they used that hate and fear to divide people by race and immigration status, and unfortunately, too many of our political leaders either agreed or were afraid to stand up to them. The Tea Partiers, though, in retrospect, now that we're out of the midst of that, did us a favor. They forced us to be clear about what we believe. As proud progressives, we believe that we are all in it together. We believe that when any one of us is better off, we are all better off. And we believe in a government that does work for all of us, regulating the greed of private companies while using public dollars to create good jobs, good schools, and public services like health coverage. And we believe that each person, whether born here or an immigrant, whether here legally or undocumented, whether gay or straight, has the same rights. So our side has to learn two things from the... Thank you. Given what we believe, our side has to learn two things from the Tea Party. One, we have to fight not just on issues, but on values and message. Our message has to be deeply grounded on our deeply felt beliefs and values, and we need to be saying what we truly believe. And number two, we have to let our grassroots base be creative and aggressive. We should not be trying to put everyone into one mold, one coalition, one campaign. As long as we're together on that fundamental message and narrative, the diversity of groups and tactics can be our greatest strength. And this year we've begun to do both of those things in our budget fights. Many of you have been involved in all of these. Citizen Action, Alliance for Quality Education, Coalition for Educational Justice, New York Communities for Change, many other organizations in this room, won restoration of nearly $500 million in state school funding by focusing on the theme, protect kids, not millionaires. And more importantly than that, and really more importantly in the long run than even the $500 million, is we won public support. Over 75% of New Yorkers support the millionaire's tax, and over 80% were opposed to cuts to education, despite and even after the Committee to Save New York, so-called, spent millions, and Governor Cuomo promoted the opposite view from ours at every chance he got to speak. We started to win that message and values war in the state. And right now in New York City, many of you are involved in fighting Mayor Bloomberg's budget cuts by unifying around making Wall Street and the banks pay. That's a message that's clear, simple, and based on our core values of fairness and equity. In this new context, we're also organizing ourselves differently. Having an overarching message that connects people's values allows that. For example, the Capitol campaign on March 30th was a good example of that. Many of you were there. We mobilized multiple constituencies, each of whom had different budget cuts they were fighting, yet everyone could be there and come together on the millionaire's tax, on the overall theme that we needed spending, not cutting, and we needed tax equity. And people could come there and do different tactics and have different activities, but yet be together on that same theme. Similarly, the On May 12th Coalition in New York City has brought together multiple constituencies around multiple issues using multiple different tactics. There's one more lesson, though, that we need to learn from these campaigns, and that's that the message and tactics need to focus on a clear decision maker. Governor Cuomo was unscathed by our budget campaign. Although 3/4 of New Yorkers agree with us, and not with Cuomo, on education cuts and the tax cut for millionaires, 3/4 of New Yorkers still think favorably of our governor. And that's also why we did not stop the tax cut to millionaires. Having a clear, values-based message is good, but it only helps you win when you're also clear about who's making the decision and what you're expecting of them. The On May 12th Coalition, with its clear focus on Bloomberg, is doing just that. So that makes it 3 lessons. Organize around a clear narrative based on values, that's the first. Second, create campaigns that have room for creativity, diversity of tactics and a range of issues. And third, be clear about who the decision maker is that needs to act. And I want to talk about how we need to use these lessons to move on to the big fight ahead of us. Because while these budget fights have been crucial and we have to keep fighting them, we've really got to focus now on the main issues shaping our future, the economy and jobs. And that's what I want to spend the last few minutes on here, is how can we begin to reshape the debate about the economy and jobs? That's what we now need to, if we really want justice, that's what we need to focus on. Because we are now, in terms of our economy, at a transformational moment. This is not one more low point in the business cycle. We're seeing that as we see, the recovery is not a recovery. The economy is not going to come back in the same way. The jobs we had are not coming back. We need a new economy that has a different kind of jobs. We need an economy that works for all of us and not just for the wealthy. People in this country may be worried about the deficit, but they care a lot more about jobs. Yet, despite that, the conversation in Congress is all about shrinking the government to shrink the deficit, instead of about creating jobs and growing the economy and the middle class. We have to change that. And here in New York State, all the talk is about tax caps instead of about jobs. Governor Cuomo's agenda is cutting taxes for the wealthy, cutting state aid to schools and localities, cutting funding for public services without any plan at all for economic development. Nothing that will create a strong economy for New York. Just the opposite, in fact. The governor's policies so far will lead to tens of thousands of layoffs of teachers and public employees, and the spillover effects from that will further damage our economy, especially in upstate New York. Now, bear with me for a moment. I'll just give you a few numbers. The Fiscal Policy Institute found that over the last 3 decades, the incomes of the richest 1% of New Yorkers, the richest 1%, grew 36 times as fast as the rest of the population. And they still pay a smaller percentage of their income in total taxes than the rest of us. At the same time, Wall Street pay more than doubled, and now we're at a situation now where the richest 5% of New Yorkers actually receive $1 out of every $2 that all of us make across the entire state. So we add all of our incomes and wages all together, and 1 out of every 2 of those dollars goes to the top 5% of the wealthiest New Yorkers. For the rest of New Yorkers, here's what's happening. Median hourly wages have gone up less than 1% over the last 2 decades. That's 1% over the entire period, not each year. And the average real earnings of a young, college-educated worker actually fell by a whopping 14%. This kind of growing income inequality is destroying our economic future as well as people's lives. How would Governor Cuomo address these widening gaps? What's his plan to raise the standard of living for the middle class and young people entering the job market? How will he rejuvenate the upstate economy? We are not hearing any answers. So I think we need to provide them. To turn the economy around and attack income inequality, we need an agenda to create good jobs for everyone. We need a government that works for all of us, that makes the decisions that build a strong middle class and helps people move into that middle class. Now is the time for all of us to focus on a shared economic message and narrative and direct it at the governor, demanding a plan to create jobs. There are many important pieces to a jobs program, but the first few steps are things we already know. They're pretty simple. Number 1, we need good schools. We need to improve education from pre-K through college graduation so that our next generation is ready for 21st century jobs in a global economy. We need to make our public universities affordable and use the strength of our universities to drive economic development. Step 2, also really simple, fair taxes. With the rollback of the income tax surcharge on the wealthiest New Yorkers, the tax cut that our state's about to give, a school aide making $20,000 a year will pay the same tax rate as Mayor Bloomberg and the president of JP Morgan Chase. That is just wrong. We can't have good schools or good jobs without revenue. And those who benefited from the good times and government bailouts can and should pay. New York needs a fair tax system, beginning with extension of the millionaire's tax before it expires in December. And we'll be talking later about how we're going to fight to make sure that happens. Third, as Jobs with Justice Now, Align New York, and SEIU 32BJ have said in their Getting Our Money's Worth campaign, we have to use the existing state economic development money, that's $8 billion a year right now, that New York gives away in tax breaks and subsidies for businesses, most of whom do not create jobs. We have to use that money to create living wage, middle-class jobs in New York State. And fourth, New York needs to enact basic policies that provide security and opportunity to families. To start with, we've got to increase the state minimum wage and pay decent unemployment benefits. There's a lot of great ideas out there that many of you are working on to create jobs in New York State, but those are 4 simple first steps. We need to stop now and take a hard look at our work. We know that we're right on the issues. We know that our priorities and values are the priorities and values of the majority of New Yorkers and of Americans. But we've allowed others to frame the issues and control the debate. As a result, poor and middle-class people have given up hope that government can solve their problems. The most recent public opinion research by Stan Greenberg finds that people know they are being screwed by the wealthy, the banks, and large corporations. People get it. They understand that the middle class is being crushed. And 2 years ago, people, by and large, the vast majority looked to the government for help to stop that. Now, they believe that the same people who control the economy also control our government. So they do not believe that government will deliver for ordinary people. It's our job to give people back hope by telling the truth about the economy and about money and politics, and by showing people that if we build a movement, we can stand up to the powerful, wealthy, and win. By focusing on good schools and good jobs and anchoring that platform in a message and narrative that demands an economy that builds the middle class and works for all of us. By organizing in a creative way that allows organizations and activists to link the message to their specific issues and constituencies and use tactics that come from the bottom up. And by targeting our work on the governor and, of course, the congressional Republicans, demanding that they provide the jobs that they have promised, we can change the debate and move the country toward progressive values and policies, and we can begin to build a more powerful progressive movement. And we hope that at this conference is a chance for us to really work together and figure out more how we're going to do that. In the afternoon roundtable tomorrow afternoon, we'll be hearing from an amazing panel of leaders of our movement talking about what they've seen work and how we can most effectively move forward. And we'll be asking each of you at that time to share some of your thoughts about what inspires you and what you think can move our movement forward to take on the economy and jobs and change the debate. We hope that this conference, that the Justice Works Conference, will help you learn, share, and network with allies from across the state, and we hope that it brings you new ideas and inspiration. We hope that it helps all of us come together to build a powerful movement for justice. Thank you.